Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Research to Reps Roundtable. We have a special guest, Dana Santis. And did I do that wrong?
No, that was good.
All right, there we go. All right. Welcome to the Research to Reps Roundtable. We have another episode with our special guest, Dana Santis. And along with me are Ted Lambrinidis and Mackenzie Holzneck. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
everything going?
Oh, everything's going good. Everything's going good. Thank you all so much for getting together. Dana, I know that we have been trying to get you on the Be Legendary podcast platform, and we're able to do it. You and I had a chance to connect at a conference a few weeks back, the Sports Academy, and you were fantastic. After watching you present, we made an immediate date on the calendar to get you on the podcast. So welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, and thank you. It's an honor to be on the podcast. So I really appreciate that. And thanks for the kind words about my presentation. It was great to connect with you there. But I am a breathing, mobility, and mind-body coach in professional sports. I actually wear quite a few hats, but that is usually the way that people identify me. I'm known as the mobility maker. That's my handle on all my social media, but it's actually a nickname that I was given by one of the athletic trainers for the Tampa Bay Lightning like 15 years ago. And then it just stuck. And so now I can be in the airport. This has happened before, traveling to go, do a presentation or work with a team. And someone ran after me yelling, "Mobility maker." And so I answered to that at this point. So that is, and you would know, Pat, that I have the Mobility Maker bench. So I can also call myself, I guess, an inventor, the Mobility Maker bench that's made by Sorinex. So that's very cool, having that piece of equipment. And it's super versatile. I won't do an ad for it, but people should go check it out on the Sorinex website for sure. And then, and it's also on my website.
You should do an ad for it right quick.
I should. Well, it's like the most versatile bench. I mean, it truly is a bench that you can use for mobility, but you can also use it for overall training. And Bert Soren and I made some videos that people can check out on YouTube. They're linked. Those YouTube videos are linked on the Sorinex site as well as on my site. So people just check it out. But then another hat that I wear is author. I have a book called Practical Solutions for Back Pain Relief. I wrote that 3 or 4 years ago. And now I'm just doing all kinds of ads. It's available on Amazon. But and I'm really proud of it. I mean, back pain, I have personally, like most people, I have herniated discs. And so most people out there, you have herniated discs, whether you know it or not, whether you've had an MRI, it doesn't mean that your life is over. It just means that you have to be more intentional about your training. We should all be intentional about our training, but that's pretty much the premise of the book, how we can proactively take care of ourselves, and that, back pain isn't this thing that we have to live with. And then I guess for that was 3 hats. My 4th hat, for the past, 7 or 8 years have been a health and wellness expert for CNN. So I put out a couple of stories a month on CNN. Right now, I'm actually working on a 4-part series on, Pat, you'll understand this, why breathing is your superpower. Because as a breathing coach and someone who has been speaking on basically why breathing is a superpower for many, many years, that is near and dear to my heart. So I think that's pretty much the overview.
Oh, that's it. No big deal.
Well, I'm a mom and a wife and a friend.
Yeah.
Those things, and those things are those things are the most important things. And a mom to rescue dogs that we just mentioned that we hope aren't going to bark during the podcast.
Well, that I think is still hoping that they do. But so with breathing and mobility, I'm sure that a lot of people, when they think about mobility, they immediately think muscles and tendons and ligaments and stretching, and they're not flexible and they've tried really hard. They've even like, stretched for 20 minutes every night and it just nothing seems to work and they just stay stiff and all the like at no point does breathing come to mind as a solution. So how do you even approach this subject with so many people who have been so conditioned to believe that it's all muscular or like that breathing is not even a thing to think about. So how do you start with educating or breathe, yeah, where do you start in with people?
Well, that's a great question. That is the question that I have been working on and refining my answer to over the past 7 or 8 years, and I think that I've gotten pretty decent at it. And that's pretty much, Pat, like during that presentation you saw me do, that's what I was trying to get to the heart of is getting people to understand breathing is a movement pattern. Not only is it a movement pattern, I would argue that it is the most fundamental movement pattern. There's not another movement pattern that you do more times every day that's actually controllable other than blinking. And we can just take blinking out of the equation because it does not have the same impact on every other kinetic chain in your body the way that breathing does. And so one of the places that I start is to get people to think about their rib cage, right? The position of your rib cage. It takes, your rib cage takes up almost 50% of your axial skeleton. So that's a whole lot of real estate. And what is the primary dictator of the position of your rib cage? If you were to take a deep breath right now that was really vertical, like the one that we generally take when we go to the doctor's office and they say, hey, take a deep breath, and you just shrug your shoulders basically up to your ears, you just moved your rib cage up. So if you tend to have a vertical upper chest breathing pattern, which is what unfortunately most of us tend to have fallen into, then that means that your rib cage is going to be lifted and protracted. Now, how does that have an impact on other things? Well, there's that cascading impact now on all of these different chains in your body because we're pulling other muscles out of their regular jobs to now do this vertical breathing pattern to lift your rib cage up because we're not really using our primary respiratory muscle, which is our diaphragm, because we've ended up in this vertical breathing pattern. The diaphragm doesn't work as well in a vertical breathing pattern. And I'll explain that in a minute. But one of the other things that I think is easier for people to grasp is as we're looking at the rib cage, what do the ribs attach to? The ribs attach to the spine. So we always equate posture with our spine, but somehow miss the fact that the rib cage is a huge component of that. We always equate T-spine rotation, for those of us who train athletes in particular and rotational athletes, we're always worried about T-spine rotation, right? Or overhead athletes, we're always worried about scapular mechanics, shoulder mechanics, the shoulder girdle. Well, how can you not take into consideration the rib cage? And again, the primary dictator of the position of your rib cage is going to be your breathing pattern. So let's once more, and then I'm going to stop because I'm sure you might have some follow-up questions, but let's once more take a look at that rib cage and let's look at how the ribs, and so just envision this, how the ribs attach to the spine. You're not going to do any T-spine rotation independent of rib movement. The rib cage has to move, right? It has to move. So you've got to have a mobile rib cage because your T-spine doesn't automatically detach from your ribs just to rotate you. But I think sometimes people think that they just don't take into consideration ribs are attached there. Then the other thing is, okay, yeah, we want our scaps to work well, our shoulder blades to work well. Well, our shoulder blades, the way that they function is they glide on the position of your rib cage. So for them to function optimally, your rib cage has to be positioned optimally. So now, you made the point, Mackenzie, of the fact that people do 20 minutes of stretching, so let's look at, the people who are doing 2 hours of, shoulder mechanics work, or they're still just pushing a rock up a hill if they're not addressing the most fundamental movement pattern and getting that rib cage into an optimal position and those ribs mobilized for movement. And the key to doing that is breathing. So now I'll shut up and let me know what you think of that.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm pretty sure, I know I did, but probably most of our listeners kind of like sat up a little straighter or, like moved a little bit of like, okay, what does it feel like? Where are they supposed to be? What's supposed to be happening?
Exactly.
So I'm sure that'll happen a few times throughout this episode.
Well, yeah. And so that's why I tell people posture is breathing. Breathing is posture. Don't think of them as two separate things, because the way that you breathe is going to determine your posture because of it being a determining factor of your rib cage position. So they are virtually the same thing. So that's the other thing. When I read an article or I see, a video that's tips on fixing your posture and breathing isn't mentioned, it's just a big face palm for me. Really? How is that possible? How do we not mention breathing? It's just incredible.
So Dana, let's just say that you're going in to do a session with a professional team. And if you gave a coach some guidelines in terms of 4 teaching cues to implement proper breathing, what would they be?
4 teaching cues. Okay. So there are 3 elements that I want people to think about. And I don't want to jump too far down the rabbit hole of why not to do the breathe into your belly cue, because that'll set me off big time. That's oh man, I know it's well-intentioned, but please do not try to breathe into your belly. It actually messes up the rib kinematics, and it's inaccurate. We can't breathe into our bellies. So I want them first to think about 3 elements: ribs. So, the rib cage, ribs, lungs, and diaphragm. It's pretty simple. Those are the 3 key elements to breathing that I want people to focus on. Now, the diaphragm, you can't really make it contract or relax. Like, it's not like your bicep in that sense where, I can say, okay, I want to contract my bicep. You could all do it right now. To contract your diaphragm, you have to use it to take an inhale. So that's the contraction. And then on the exhale, that's the relaxation. And that's really the most important part. So the first cue is, let's focus on the 3 elements that are really involved in respiration. The second one would be, let's get how the ribs move. So we have the split in our rib cage right below our sternum. It's called your infrasternal angle. And there's that split in your ribs for a good reason, because those ribs are designed to move. So the second cue is that we're going to try to mobilize our ribs to facilitate that contraction and relaxation of the diaphragm, because the diaphragm is attached in here. So I have people place their hands on those lower ribs. So your fingertips can feel the edge of that infrasternal angle. On an inhale, those ribs are externally rotating, so they're moving out. So remember how I was saying, we don't want a vertical breath, we want a horizontal breath. So as I inhale, with my hands on my ribs, I should feel my ribs moving out. Here's the most important part. As I exhale, that infrasternal angle should start to narrow. Those ribs move in, back, and down. So if people are doing this right now, and usually they tell me when they're listening to a podcast and I'm explaining this, they've got their hands on their ribs, exhale. Don't inhale to exhale. Find whatever air is in there and exhale. And feel if you can start to get those ribs to move in. Once you do that, then the diaphragm relaxes and domes inside the rib cage, and it's primed to inhale for you. Because like I said, remember, it's without the inhale, facilitated by the diaphragm, we can't really just make the diaphragm contract. So we've got to get it to relax in order to contract. So it's the exhale. So it's that rib mobility. So you focus on the 3 things: ribs, lungs, diaphragm. Now you focus on getting the ribs to move in and out with the inhalation, the contraction, and the exhalation, the relaxation. And really, the other thing I would say is we want people to breathe in and out of their nose. They're going to be able to control the breath better, but also that way you're getting nitric oxide, which is expressed from your paranasal sinuses. And that's a vasodilator. So that's going to increase oxygenation, which everybody thinks they need to inhale more. And that's why they're trying to take these big, expansive inhales. But the key is that you exhale more. So I guess I would say I gave you the 3 elements: the rib mobilization, breathing through your nose, at least the inhales. The exhale, if it's out of your mouth, that's fine, as long as the inhale is in through your nose. And then the 4th part would be focus on the exhales. Now, I'll get into the science a little bit with you guys because I know you're picking up what I'm putting down, and a lot of people listening will understand this, but it's not that complex. People act like breathing is rocket science. It's not rocket science. It's science, but it's not rocket science. So the reason the exhales are so important is because we need carbon dioxide levels to rise enough to exchange with the oxygen. Unfortunately, when we're stuck in that overbreathing pattern that we talked about, the vertical one up in our chest that's rapid and shallow, we're constantly inhaling more than we're exhaling, right? So we're not able to use all of that oxygen that we're taking in. So then you're like, well, then why do we keep exhaling if we're not able to use all of this oxygen that we're taking in? Unfortunately, as amazing as these machines are that we reside in, you know, that's meat suit that you've got going on, it's miraculous, but it sometimes needs a reset. What happens is in this overbreathing cycle, we have these things called chemoreceptors in the base of our brain. Their job is to tell us when we need to inhale, because we know that breathing is the most important thing for life. So they're trying to keep us alive by saying, okay, CO2 levels are rising, you better inhale. Now, when we were younger, before, whether it was chronic stress, an injury, an illness, something knocked us out of our regular breathing pattern, we didn't used to breathe so rapid and shallow. We actually used to use our diaphragm better, and those chemoreceptors weren't oversensitized to rises in levels of CO2, and they were fine with it, which is really good, because actually CO2 has a calming effect. The exhale and rising levels of CO2 are associated with your parasympathetic system. That's why, like, what do you do if you're scared? It's a gasp, it's an inhale. That's sympathetic. What do you do when you're, de-stressing or sigh of relief, right? That's an exhale. That's your parasympathetic system. So what we need to do is retrain those chemoreceptors at the base of our brain. It's not that hard, just to be able to handle longer exhales, to handle rises in CO2, because it takes a few reps for you to just, you have to get over that alarm that goes off in your brain that says, inhale, inhale, inhale. No, I know I'm fine. I'm not going to pass out. Just do that for a few reps, longer exhales, pause after the exhale. And then what you'll find is you actually start to feel calmer. And then that pause after the exhale can be longer. And CO2 levels can rise. It's really not, you could have 30, 40 years of kind of poor breathing mechanics that we can clean up in a really short amount of time, because your body wants to function right. So it's not rocket science. This isn't, I know that chemoreceptors, it's a new word for some people, and some people kind of freak out, but we invest all of this time and energy into figuring out all the apps on our phones. Could we take a few minutes to maybe, I don't know, figure out the stuff that keeps us alive every day and moving and feeling better? Probably.
Well, Dana, when I said, can you be on the podcast? We have 2 platforms, Beyond Sets and Reps or Research to Reps Roundtable. Do you want to talk more about Dana, or do you want to get nerdy? And you said, oh, let's get nerdy. You are definitely getting nerdy. So I wrote down, you alluded to something I actually wrote down in my next question. And I guess I focused a lot on breathing in terms of the psychological and what happens in terms of arousal level and being able to get yourself excited or calm down. But then you just touched on the physiological, whether it's the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. You started off talking about the physical parts of breathing and the impacts. So I guess the question I want to ask is, how do all of those work together? And then where does breathing intersect with mindfulness?
Oh, Well, you just teed me up for some really exciting stuff that I love to share. I mean, because yes, breathing is a superpower. That's why I told you I'm doing this next series on CNN, and I'm literally telling people it's a superpower. Like it's the one true superpower that we all possess. But basically, it's misunderstood, and because of that, we don't leverage it. And in fact, it ends up working against us when we don't leverage it, because my example of us being stuck in an overbreathing pattern, because that will then put us into that sympathetic state. And then it'll also create chronic tension because you're taking upwards of 20,000 breaths every day. So in terms of like total mind and body, it can optimize all of that, how you move, think, and feel, or it can work against you, how you move, think, and feel. And what's really unfortunate is when people are unaware. Like I tell athletes often when I look at their breathing pattern, I see how they're breathing, and they're seeing me for something like back pain or shoulder pain. And obviously we're going to start with breathing because I can clean that up. And then we see if we really have an issue there. Most times, honestly, we don't, because you clean up the breathing pattern and it was the contributor to the back pain, the primary issue. Or anyway, I go back to them and I say, the way that you think you feel isn't really the way that you think or feel. It's being caused by this breathing pattern. The same breathing pattern that was wrecking your back is the same breathing pattern that's essentially making you an asshole. And they don't realize it. This is why you snap at people. This is why you have, this huge level of frustration all the time, and you feel agitated all the time. It's because you are stuck in a breathing pattern that's really revving up your sympathetic nervous system, telling you, life isn't an emergency and life isn't going your way. And when we can calm that down, we change our brain state. We change how we think and feel, and everything is clearer and calmer. I've had athletes who've said to me, one of my favorite quotes was from Tim Thomas, who is a former NHL player. He was one of my longest term clients, one of my first clients ever. So this was almost 20 years ago. And he was a hockey goalie for the Boston Bruins. And I was with them when they won the Stanley Cup, and he won the Conn Smythe, just super cool. But he loved Star Wars. And so and I was just like scratching the surface with what I knew about breathing back then. Man, what we could have done together, at this point. But he used to say, when I control my breathing, I have control of everything. It's like I've got the force. I can slow down everything that's happening on the ice and just snatch the puck out of the air with all of this control. And that's how, the commentators for the games would say, it's insane. It's like Tim can just grab the pucks out of the air like they're not going, a million miles per hour. And that's what breathing can do for all of us. And Pat, I had just shared with you that I recently teamed with a Harvard-backed neuroscience company called BrainCo. And they have this Focus Calm technology, which is a neurofeedback headband. And this headband is paired with an app. And so I have created science-based breathing protocols for them, where now we can measure, what I was talking about in extending the exhales and extending those pauses after, and how it has a calming effect on your nervous system. We can actually measure in real time what that's doing to your brain state. And it has amazing positive effects across the board. It's really cool. So it's truly a superpower that has the ability to change, to optimize all aspects of how we think, move, and feel.
So what you just described is mindfulness.
Yes. Yes, being able to be in this focused and calm state. And the way to get there is your breathing. You can't get there without your breathing. So whether someone meditates and unbeknownst to them while they were meditating, they changed their breathing, because let's say it wasn't a breathing-based meditation, they're still using their breathing to get there, because that's the key. It's the key to unlocking our autonomic nervous system. It's the only aspect of our autonomic nervous system that we can actually control. And there's a good reason for it. Control your breathing, control yourself.
Yeah. And I see on your table there that you have James Nestor's book, Breath, which I was
Oh, yes.
completely fascinated by. And it talks about like Wim Hof breathing in ancient times. And it's really all this knowledge that we knew about, but it got lost in translation and lost over time. And now it's coming back, and it's almost like people are seeing breath work and breathing as this new fad. And then, but there's the experts in the field like yourself that are like, this isn't new. Like this controls everything. So I kind of was wondering if you get a little bit cringy when people bring up like Wim Hof breathing and all the things, or if like, because it has become such a trendy thing. But so I didn't know how you felt about that, with it being, you don't want it to be a trend. This is a real thing that it's been around. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, so there are pros and cons for your example of Wim Hof breathing. If for sure, I don't want it to be a trend. What I love about anyone who's teaching breathing is that at least where it's becoming more acceptable. Again, it's one of those facepalm things for me. I mean, without breath, there's no life. How come it's such a stretch to understand that the quality of our breathing impacts the quality of our lives? Like, to me, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
But so it's good that these things are bringing breathing to the forefront. I have personal experience in pro sports, seeing what someone just taking a deep dive into Wim Hof breathing, and that's it, what that does to their movement patterns. It's not great. It's not great. I've seen a lot of oblique strains, especially in rotational sports. And I'm just going to be honest. And I know the Wim Hof people are going to be pissed at me, but you know what? You can use your Wim Hof breathing and walk up a snowy mountain in your underwear. Awesome. Like that. I mean, that is that. And I'm kidding, but I'm not kidding, because you literally can do that.
Yeah.
You can remember, control your breathing, control yourself. So if that's what you want to do, is control your nervous system in that way, it's a great illustration of how breathing can control your nervous system. But is that what we want to do on a regular basis? Is that going to fuel the other aspects of our lives the way that we need it to? I would say no, especially since I've seen it in personal experience. I've seen it. I've seen too many issues with the inability to rotate. Because think about Wim Hof. If you've seen any of the Wim Hof breathing in the big, now they are mobilizing their rib cages, but they're also lifting their rib cage up. So their rib cage is being taken out of an optimal position. It's optimal for the breathing patterns that they're using, which is why it can work, but it's not optimal for a center fielder or a designated hitter, or a pitcher, a Cy Young pitcher. It's just not. And I've seen that personally. So, or even a golfer. Definitely not a golfer. Please don't.
So I guess on that note, when we're talking about what's optimal for life, in your case for athletes, in our audience, they are coaches and people around athletes trying to help them perform better. How can we get them to focus on something that is traditionally very subconscious? Because even after reading James Nestor's book, there are times when I'm like, oh yeah, like I'll be driving and I'll catch myself and I will try to slow down my breathing and breathe in deeper and breathe out fully. But then as soon as I lose focus on it, it's probably right back to normal. And so how do you train a subconscious movement to make the improvements subconsciously?
That also is a great question. And how I mentioned before that over the years, I've been refining how I introduce breathing to people, how I get them to buy in, and then also how I can most efficiently and effectively produce lasting results for them. And what I've been able to come up with is an exercise that in every athlete's program that I work with, they use this exercise in their warm-up, sometimes also in their cool downs, occasionally superset with any of their big lifts, but I call it a breathing bridge. And it's essentially like a glute bridge position. So from supine, you're lifting your hips up. There's a reason for that, because I'm trying to, the pelvic floor is actually also functions as a diaphragm, and the pelvic floor works in sync with the respiratory diaphragm. So when in sync, but yeah, let me just explain, not at the same, they don't both contract at the same time. When you inhale and the respiratory diaphragm contracts, the pelvic floor relaxes. When you exhale, the diaphragm, the respiratory diaphragm relaxes, the pelvic floor contracts. And the easiest way to illustrate that is think about when you would jump, like a vertical jump. You're not going to do that on an inhale. Well, you might. You're not going to jump as high if you inhale and hold your breath and jump as you would when you exhale. I mean, you think about it naturally, that's the tendency. We're going to exhale. So when we exhale, our respiratory diaphragm relaxes, our pelvic floor contracts. That's going to give us more ups, right? So when I do this breathing bridge, what I'm trying to do is make sure that I line those up, because the coaches out there know, we hear so much about the dreaded anterior pelvic tilt. For people who aren't familiar with that, there's nothing wrong with an anterior pelvic tilt. Your pelvis is supposed to tilt anteriorly and posteriorly at will. The problem is when we get stuck in an anterior pelvic tilt, right? So when we're in an anterior pelvic tilt, just think about this. Your pelvis and your rib cage, they don't move independent of one another, because again, we're this meat suit that all works in a synchronized fashion. So if you stick your butt out, that's an anterior pelvic tilt. What just happened to your rib cage? Boom, right? Your rib cage now protracts and sticks out, which means, let's think about how the respiratory diaphragm and the pelvic floor line up. They don't. Your respiratory diaphragm is now lined up in front of you. Your pelvic floor is lined up behind you, which is going to make it very difficult for them to work properly. They need to be lined up to work in sync. So by putting an athlete in this breathing bridge position, that's a long explanation for why I'm putting you in a bridge, but I want people to get it. Because I mean, obviously you can work on your breathing in any position, because we're always doing it, but I want to make this as efficient and effective as possible. So I found that this breathing bridge works. I make sure that the knees are lined up with the hips. You place your hands on your ribs, like we were talking about before. You make sure that your cervical spine is neutral. For some people who are kind of stuck in that anterior pelvic tilt with a protracted rib cage, when you lay them down flat, you're going to notice that their chin is jutting up and their neck's tilted back. So I kind of cue them to pack their neck. We stick a towel underneath, because you want to make sure cervical spine is neutral. Hands are on their ribs. Start with an exhale. If people listening get nothing out of this except for the fact that when they need to focus on their breathing, so like Mackenzie, when you remember in the car, I don't want you to inhale, I want you to exhale. So start with the exhale. We exhale, drive those ribs in, back, and down. And then without breathing, pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt as much as you can. Use that to lift your hips up about 3 or 4 inches. Hold that position. And then you're going to take 5 or 6 breaths where on the inhale, you feel the ribs move out. If you start to feel engagement of your pecs, and God forbid your neck on the inhale, that's when you stop and you move to the exhale. So as soon as you start to feel that upper body engagement, you're going to move into the exhale. Elongate the exhale, get all the air out, pause. I tend to, once I get people to really get this, I tend to do what I call a 5-7-3 breathing pattern. So it's 5 inhale, 7 exhale, 3 pause. You do 5 or 6 of those, right? If you did 6, that's a 90-second commitment. I like people to do 2 sets. So 3 minutes a day. Here's my experience. Within 2 weeks, now you start to own that breathing pattern. Now your breathing starts to become more functional. It doesn't mean you're breathing 5-7-3 all the time when you're not thinking about it. But when your breathing is returned to your autonomic nervous system, you're not thinking about it, you're going about your daily life, your rib movement is facilitating your diaphragm function. We're not breathing in that we don't have that over breathing pattern. Our chemoreceptors are no longer oversensitized. Like, we own it. Now, one of the quickest ways to get buy-in, because I think part of your question was, I mean, breathing, it's this thing that, what did you say? It's something that's hard for people to conceive of, right?
Yeah, because it's very subconscious.
Yes.
And it's in our subconscious until we choose to bring it in the conscious. So if we don't even know it's a thing, how do we bring it into our conscious and really think about it and control it?
Right. So to kind of shock people into getting them to think about it and really understand its power, I tend to do a demo that, Pat, do you remember the video that I showed during the presentation with the internal shoulder rotation?
Yep.
Because breathing can have such a huge impact on our movement, changing our breathing. I demo that for people. So I could have like a group of athletes. I'll give an example of, since I seem to be on a baseball kick. So let's say I've got a group of baseball players. I'm going to grab, one of their starting pitchers, take him up to the front of the room. I'm going to explain to everybody, like Ted, you had asked, those 4 points. I want rib mobilization. This is what we're focused on. Everybody's going to put their hands on their ribs. We're doing this breathing bridge. But before I do the breathing bridge with, let's say his name is Sam at the front of the room, I'm going to check Sam's internal and external shoulder rotation in front of everybody. I don't use a goniometer to measure it. Everybody can just see, this is where he is. This is where we're starting from. And then I do, a set or two, sometimes it's only one set because I can tell how much he's reacting, of the breathing bridge with the guy at the front of the room while everybody else does it as well. And then everybody watches as I recheck his internal and external shoulder rotation. And sometimes we can have a difference of as much as 30%. Like, it's noticeable. There's a noticeable difference. Everybody sees it. Sam at the front of the room feels it. So now he's conveying it to his teammates, but everybody's like, what the heck just happened? Like, you didn't stretch his shoulder. All you did was change his breathing. All I did was I gave him back, like, we released all that tension, because remember, 20,000 times a day, he's taking a breath. And if he's in an upper chest oriented pattern, pecs are firing, anterior shoulder, neck, all these things are firing. I got them to stop firing. So the tension goes away. Now we've got all of that increase in mobility. I can do that with T-spine rotation. And then remember, we were just talking about the relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis. I can do it with internal hip rotation too. So like in that case, I would take the goaltender from the hockey team up to the top of the room. We check internal hip rotation, then we'd recheck it after the breathing exercise. And people lose their minds because they're like, how did that happen? It was just all we changed was breathing. But now I've got their attention, and now they're like you, Mackenzie, like they're thinking about breathing you read James Nestor's book and that had an impact on you, but now I've got them thinking. Now they're never going to think about breathing the same way again. So hopefully the people listening, same thing. Don't ever think about breathing the same way again. It's a superpower.
I agree.
Yeah.
To sum it up, I agree.
Has there been in your experience, what sport have you found to have the most mobility issues?
Oh gosh, it just, it really, there are pretty similar issues across all sports. That's why, my work has evolved to be less sport specific. When I first got into sports, sport specific was that trendy term. And if you were a sport specific, expert, then you were an expert. And it's just laughable now. These are all human bodies. And especially when we're bringing it down to this most fundamental movement pattern that we all tend to have very similar levels of dysfunction in, that they manifest in similar ways, regardless of sport. So I mean, it's just a different application, that you can see the issues with lack of mobility or the chronic tension that can be caused by this can end up with different injuries in different sports. Like, for instance, like I mentioned, the NHL. I mean, we want to make sure that these guys are really resilient, not getting separated shoulders when they're slammed up against the boards. Think about if you're in a breathing pattern that puts your rib cage and a less than optimal position that creates all of this tension, you're going to be more fragile. You're not going to be able to absorb the impact because you just don't, these muscles are already so tight in your shoulders. Your scaps aren't sitting on your rib cage in the right place. So now you get slammed up against the boards. I mean, the odds are against you in terms of being able to absorb that shock without being injured. So I see a lot more of that in the NHL. But then, you know, I mentioned rotational athletes. We end up seeing a lot of oblique strains. And then we didn't even talk about hip flexors, but I'll see a lot of hip flexor issues because your primary hip flexor, your psoas major, it actually intersects with the diaphragm at the attachment to the lumbar spine. And they're so connected that in cadavers, it appears to be one muscle. They can't dissect the two. So now think about, I mean, what we already talked about, the relationship between the rib cage and the pelvis when you go into that anterior pelvic tilt, right? So now the psoas gets shortened and tightened. And if the diaphragm, if the diaphragm isn't being used functionally, which if your rib cage is sticking out like that and lifted, that means that your infrasternal angle is really wide, which pulls the diaphragm into a contracted state. And that's where it's stuck. Right? So that's going to be a really tight muscle, which means it's also going to be tight at that attachment to the lumbar spine. And that tension is going to influence the psoas, just like the tension that the psoas already has due to that anterior pelvic tilt is going to influence the diaphragm. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. So see a lot of hip flexor issues where people are like, hey, can you, the team brings me in and says, all right, can you stretch out these hip flexors on these guys? And I'm like, yeah, we're going to do breathing. Let's see if we can give the psoas back to the body and let's just release the tension that's in there. Because otherwise, again, pushing a rock up a hill, if we just keep stretching the psoas, and not addressing the breathing. So yeah, you just across all sports, the issues with the breathing can manifest in different ways based on how they use their bodies, but it really all comes down to the same cause.
And Dana, you had said that as humans and we all have similar meat suits, a lot of our dysfunction is similar. So the fact that when we were little or when we were born, we knew how to do this, like it's innate, we can survive. Where did we go wrong, or how do we mess ourselves up that all of us, or not all, but most of us end up in adulthood not breathing the way that we were designed to breathe? Like where'd we go wrong?
So we didn't really go wrong. There are myriad reasons that breathing, like functional breathing, can get disrupted. And I'll address those in a second, but I guess, the place that we've gone wrong would be in not educating people about the importance of breathing. We understand because we can see it, right? We understand the importance of gait, of walking. It's an alternating and reciprocal movement, and we're all pretty familiar with it. And when you see someone who's limping, you recognize that. Like in a child at school who's limping, we're going to say, hey, maybe they should see a doctor. There must be a reason why they're limping. We don't want that limp to continue into adulthood. And it can happen. Any of us at some point in time, we've had a limp, something's happened, right? And we have to fix it so that we walk right because we know that we should. Same approach should be taken to breathing, but even more so because it's so much more important. We could stop being able to walk and still be alive, but we can't stop being able to breathe and still be alive. And so, you get a stuffy nose and you start to breathe out of your mouth. That's natural, right? But when the stuffy nose goes away and we continue to be a mouth breather, that's going to contribute to more of that over breathing and that chest oriented breath. When we're in a stressful situation, and unfortunately, some people grow up and don't have the best childhoods, and that can contribute to, remember, it's chicken or the egg, right? Like you're in a sympathetic state. When you're in a sympathetic state, which is fight or flight, then your breathing is going to become more rapid and shallow. Your heart rate rises, your blood pressure rises, stress hormone production increases. breathing can also trigger that, as we discussed before. So again, chicken or the egg, but so if we were in a stressful situation and it became a chronically stressful situation, then yeah, our breathing needs a reset. Just like if we were limping, our walking needs a reset. We need to address it, but we're not taught to address it. And I wish I had a dollar for every time an athlete has said to me, why didn't I learn this in school? You know, I hope that before I die, that we start teaching this in school.
Yeah, that's really good, Dana. I'm looking at maybe we have time for maybe one more round of questions. And so I'm going to maybe combine two words, anger and sleep. And how does breathing impact those, or how can proper breathing mitigate that emotion and that and our sleep?
Okay. So I think anger, I've actually touched on that a little bit when I was talking about agitation and frustration, and telling athletes the way that you think you feel isn't really the way that you think or feel. It's caused by your breathing. So if we can just keep that knowledge, at least in the back of our minds, I know that, anger can be blinding, but just money's in the exhale. If you can, and we have the right idea when people say, step away and take a few breaths. It's just most people don't know what that means. They don't know how to breathe. And unfortunately, breath is generally equated to inhale. And hopefully you guys are getting that the exhale is so much more important for us right now, just based on the dysfunctional breathing patterns that we tend to get into. So step away and exhale, 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 and then pause. Hold your breath, not breath in, hold with no breath. Do that a few times and then see what your brain state is. Like I said, with that neuroscience company, using the headband and the technology, we're able to see what that does to your brain state. So you want to mitigate, feeling angry, leverage your exhales. Same thing with stress. And then now for sleep, we know that we need to be in a parasympathetic state. One of the reasons that sleep eludes so many people is because they're unknowingly constantly revving that fight or flight sympathetic aspect of their nervous system. And it's virtually impossible to get almost fall asleep, but even get quality sleep when that's happening with your nervous system, because you have to go into that rest and restore aspect of your nervous system. So using your breathing, and Pat, I say this in my presentations and you saw it, like, I have nothing against sheep. You can count your sheep, just attach the sheep to a breath count. So, I'm going to start counting my breaths backwards. This is a breathing exercise I use with a lot of my athletes. And I say, okay, we're going to count our breaths backwards as we're falling asleep. And we're going to start at a higher number, like 50 or 40, because we generally don't count backwards from there, which is going to help focus our mind just enough to get the chatter out. And we're going to count each breath and we're going to see the number 50. And if you want to put it like, on a sheep as they're jumping over a fence, go for it. But we see the number 50 come up as we inhale. It goes away as we exhale. We pause. The next one, 49, the sheep or whatever. And then it goes away as we and you keep counting. Usually, I'll have athletes say to me, I last number I remember is 17. And then I woke up in the morning. Awesome. That's what you want. But if you get back to one, start over again. But that's leveraging your breathing to get into a parasympathetic state and using those long exhales. So that's it.
That's awesome. So Dana, usually on the Beyond Sets and Reps roundtable, we do an intake form, and then we there's a question on there. Are there any topics to avoid? With this one, we didn't send that to you, but you shared something that I learned about you that's very personal, and that breathing is attached to. And it moved me a lot because it is beyond a passion for you. Like, for you, it's life. Like, And I don't know if you can go into that just a little bit, maybe, and then we'll wrap it up.
So are you speaking specifically about my youngest son?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I just want to make sure. So yes, when my youngest son was born, he actually he wouldn't open his eyes for the first 4 days, which was my first cue. And he's my youngest son. I have 3 children, and for anyone who has kids, you're when your child is born, you're waiting for that moment when they lock eyes with you, because that's the coolest thing, right? That's the connection. And 4 days he wouldn't open his eyes, and he was just there was just an energy about him that felt uncomfortable. He seemed uncomfortable, and I had the doctor pry his little eyes open and check to see, and he's like, it seems like they're working, and his pupils dilate. He's just not ready to open his eyes. And a lot of parents, I'm sure, who have children who are on the spectrum have heard the whole watch and wait thing. Don't ever watch and wait. Definitely watch. Don't wait. Yeah, keep doing whatever you can to advocate for your child and get the resources necessary. I am not a watch and wait person, in case you guys have not figured that out. And so I knew there's something up with my kid, and I need to give him the best opportunity at life. And so I need to figure out what's going on. By the time he was 9 months old, we had a diagnosis, which is and it was I think it was pervasive developmental disorder. So that was the first one, the precursor to autism. And I was told at that point he may never speak normally, and that he may never let us touch him or hold him, because he really did not like to be touched at all. His nervous system was constantly so revved up. So think about that agitation becoming visceral, right? That he did not want to be touched. Definitely not light touch. It could be a harder touch, like he wanted to slam himself up against things. And when you're not close to someone with autism, you look at the stuff and you think it's weird, but when you start to really break down the science behind what's going on, it starts to make a whole lot of sense. And I was lucky enough, because my son is now 12, that this was 12 years ago. And this was right when I was on the cusp of learning about all of this. So it was just perfect timing, and everything happens for a reason. I mean, we know that, right? So it's perfect timing. Here I am facing this biggest obstacle of my life while I'm learning about the most life-changing thing, in not only in my career, but little did I know, in my life, finding out that, this breathing, there's so much more to it. So I started to remember I talked about the anterior pelvic tilt, what happens to the rib cage. Well, one of the hallmarks, although autism is a spectrum, so there can be so many variations to it. One of the hallmarks of autism for many people is toe walking. So think about that. And if you're not familiar with toe walking and autism, just think about wearing super high heels. What does that do to your center of mass? What does that do to your pelvis, your rib cage? Consequently, what's that going to do to your breathing pattern? And I looked at his little rib cage, so protracted and so immobile. And his infrasternal angle was super wide. So that meant that diaphragm is stuck in a contracted position. And I started working on getting him to exhale. He would have meltdowns that would last 4 hours at a time. Again, when he was little, it seemed like he was nonverbal. He said very little. We were doing speech therapy, and the therapist kept trying to touch him, because that's what they do in speech therapy. And as I started to learn more about what was going, or at least started to hypothesize based on what I was learning about what might be going on with him, I had the speech therapist back off. I'm like, this kid, there's a lot going on in there. Just, you've got to back off. She started to back off. She started to take some of my cues. We were working on the breathing. I was getting him to exhale. I played this game. He would make these noises like lawnmowers and cars. He was fascinated by engines. So I would have him like make this buzzing sound, like a motor. I'm going to sound silly, but like that. But that's an exhale, right? I would have him do that. It would also relax his face and jaw. Like if you guys do that, it relaxes your face and jaw. It's an exhale. We're starting to become a little more parasympathetic. Then I started doing, blow into my hand for as long as you can. Again, it's an exhale. I'd have him race with his dad. So, his dad would intentionally not be able to exhale as long as him. So can you do it for a count of 10? So what was I doing? When you exhale, think about what happens to your rib cage position. Those ribs start to come in, back and down. Your upper body starts to relax. I would see his face start to change. Well, once we started to incorporate these things, I got the speech therapist to back off. He was kicked out of speech therapy by the time he was 13 months because he started speaking complete sentences. He skipped the babbling and just went to, hey, Mom, can I have a drink of water? It was incredible. He also started to sit next to us on the couch. He started to let us touch him. And at this point now, his psychologist says to me, Dana, we should probably not tell anyone that he was ever diagnosed on the autism spectrum because they would think we're nuts. My son has, Pat, you make me cry. I've told the story a million times, but because when they told me he might not talk or, let us touch him, or you have this vision of what your child's future might look like. And I thought he might never have friends, play sports, do the fun kid thing, be a kid. And he just turned 12 and we had a pool party for him. He had all of his friends over. I've coached his basketball team before. He's awesome at basketball, just an amazing athlete. And it's hard to believe that this is his story. It's really hard to believe, but this is truly why breathing is a superpower. It's life changing.
Yeah. Dana, I can't thank you enough for sharing that. You are awesome. Thank you for being the person you are, the mom, the wife you are, the friend. I feel like we've known each other for so long and we have it. So thank you for sharing. Thank you, for your time, your effort, your energy. And this has been an awesome episode. So Mac and Ted, I know you might want to say some closing remarks here.
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's so powerful, and we can sense it in the way that you talk about breathing and the impact that you have on people. And clearly, there's so much more for all of us to learn. If you wouldn't mind, can you share where people can find you? Because this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you can help people with and the impact. And so, yeah, please tell our listeners where they can find you and connect with you.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's mobilitymaker.com is my website. And as I mentioned before, at mobilitymaker is, that's my handle on all social media. I tend to post more on Instagram than anywhere else. And that's where I try to share as many resources as I can.
I'd just like to say, hey, thanks for sharing that story, Dana. That was special. And you've got great passion for your profession. One last thing, aside from your book, could you recommend one or two books for our listeners?
Oh, absolutely. And I've been calling you Mackenzie, but then Pat just called you Mac. So I'll call you Mac now. Mac mentioned, well, you mentioned Breath by James Nestor, and it's a fantastic book. I'm so glad that he wrote this because there's such great info in there. And he talks about his personal experience doing different, basically experiments on himself in terms of breathing. It's a great read. Also, you can listen to it on Audible as well. I listen to so many of my books on Audible. I listened to it first on Audible, and then I had to get the hardcover because then I went through it again. Yeah. And then the other book that I know that it might not seem like it has anything to do with what I've talked about today, but if you knew my own personal life story, you would understand that it's the reason that I'm here. But Man's Search for Meaning, that Viktor Frankl, it changed my life. It really did. I didn't have the greatest childhood. I mean, I moved out of my house when I was 14, and I use the term house loosely. And I became a mom at 16. You know, it was a challenging beginning to my life, and there were so many times when I was ready to give up. And then even as I became more successful, I harbored a lot of resentment for how I had grown up that was holding me back. And then I read that book in college, and it taught me how to make my pain purposeful. And that's a game changer. It's seriously a game changer. And then it introduced me to gratitude, like in a way that I had never seen before. And that's why, like, when I talk about these things, I have so much passion, because I am so great. I'm grateful for every breath that I get to take. And I'm grateful for the fact that I'm able to talk to you, but I'm able to do what I love every day. It's amazing. And that book really opened my eyes to that. So.
Wow. Thank you, Dana. Appreciate you. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Mac. It's been another awesome episode, and I'll see you soon. Take
Thank
care,
you,
everyone.
guys.
Take care.
Thank you.